Thaddeus Blackwell arrived home early from his business trip, expecting silence in his Boston penthouse. Instead, he heard shouting from upstairs. He climbed the marble stairs and froze at what he saw through his daughter's bedroom door. Celeste, his trusted housekeeper, had her hands firmly gripped around 16-year-old Rowan's wrists. His daughter was struggling, tears streaming down her face as she tried to break free. "Stop it! Let me go!" Rowan cried out desperately. Celeste's voice was stern, almost angry. "I won't let you do this anymore!" Any father would rush in. Any father would fire the help immediately. Any father would call the police. But what this millionaire did next shocked Celeste completely. He turned around and walked away like nothing happened. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in the Blackwell penthouse. Thaddeus sat at his mahogany desk, fingers dancing across his laptop keyboard as stock prices flickered on 3 monitors surrounding him. At 46, he had built Blackwell Technologies from a basement startup into a Fortune 500 empire, but success had come at a price that haunted every corner of his sterile home. The penthouse sprawled across the top 2 floors of a historic Back Bay building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of Boston Harbor. Yet for all its luxury, the space felt hollow, like a museum exhibit of a life that had stopped living 16 years ago. Celeste Moreau moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her weathered hands preparing breakfast for a family that barely spoke to each other anymore. At 42, she had worked for the Blackwells for 8 years, watching the slow deterioration of what should have been a loving home. Her French-Canadian accent colored her words as she hummed softly, the only warmth that seemed to penetrate the cold marble and steel surfaces. She had taken this job not for the generous salary Thaddeus offered, but for reasons she kept locked away in her heart, just as he kept his grief locked away in his office safe, along with his late wife's belongings. Rowan emerged from her bedroom like a ghost haunting her own home. At 16, she possessed her mother's ethereal beauty, with cascading auburn hair and eyes the color of deep forest pools. But where Vivian had radiated life and laughter, Rowan moved through the world as if she were already disappearing. She wore long sleeves even in summer, kept her arms crossed defensively, and spoke in whispers that seemed to fade before they reached anyone's ears. Her father barely looked up as she entered the kitchen, his attention consumed by quarterly reports that meant nothing compared to the daughter he was losing one silent day at a time. "Good morning, Sherry," Celeste said softly, placing a plate of fresh strawberries and cream before Rowan. The girl managed a weak smile, the first genuine expression to cross her face in days. With Celeste, Rowan could almost remember what it felt like to be seen, to matter to someone in this vast, echoing home. But even that small comfort couldn't chase away the darkness that had taken root in her chest, growing stronger with each passing year of her father's indifference. Thaddeus finally looked up from his screens, his steel-gray eyes landing on his daughter for exactly 3 seconds before returning to his work. Those brief glances were always the same, filled with a pain so raw and immediate that Rowan had learned to look away first. She saw herself reflected in his anguish and knew, with the cruel certainty of a child who has lived too long with adult guilt, that her very existence reminded him of everything he had lost. The mother who had died bringing her into this world, the love that had been buried with Vivian's body, the family that had ended before it truly began. The business trip to Chicago had been a welcome escape from the suffocating atmosphere of home. For 3 days, Thaddeus had thrown himself into merger negotiations, board meetings, and client dinners, anything to avoid the empty spaces where conversation should have lived. His assistant had booked him on a red-eye flight, but a cancelled meeting had freed up his afternoon, allowing him to catch an earlier plane home. He told himself it was efficiency, but deep down, a part of him that he tried to ignore wondered if Rowan might actually be glad to see him return early. The penthouse was quieter than usual when he stepped off the private elevator, his Italian leather briefcase in one hand, his coat draped over his arm. Celeste's humming drifted from the kitchen, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the years. She was the one constant in their fractured household, the steady presence who kept their lives functioning even when they could barely function themselves. He had never asked why she stayed, never questioned her dedication to a family that seemed determined to fall apart despite every luxury money could provide. The sound hit him like a physical blow as he reached the second floor. Rowan's voice, higher and more desperate than he had heard in years, crying out in what sounded like genuine distress. His businessman's mind, trained to assess and respond to crises, kicked into overdrive as he moved toward her bedroom. The door stood partially open, and through the gap he could see movement, struggle, the unmistakable signs of a physical confrontation that made his blood run cold. What he witnessed through that doorway shattered every assumption he had built about his carefully controlled world. Celeste, the woman he trusted above all others, had Rowan pinned against her desk, both hands wrapped around the teenager's wrists in what looked like a violent struggle. His daughter's face was streaked with tears, her body writhing as she tried to break free from the older woman's grip. The scene burned itself into his retinas with crystal clarity, every detail magnified by shock and disbelief. "Stop it! Let me go!" Rowan's voice cracked with desperation, a sound that should have sent any father charging into the room to protect his child. "I need to. I have to." Her words dissolved into sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul, raw and broken in a way that spoke of pain far deeper than physical restraint. Celeste's response was firm, almost harsh, her accent thickening with emotion. "No, I won't let you do this anymore. You think this is the answer? You think causing yourself pain will make him love you?" Her words carried a weight that suggested this was not their first such confrontation, that she had been fighting this battle while he remained oblivious in his tower of willful ignorance. Any normal father would have burst through that door without hesitation. Any loving parent would have demanded explanations, called for help, done something, anything, to protect their child from apparent harm. The civilized world had clear rules about such situations, protocols that any decent human being would follow without question. But Thaddeus Blackwell, for all his success and intelligence, was no longer a normal father, and had not been one for many years. Instead, he stood frozen in the hallway, his briefcase slipping from nerveless fingers to hit the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. Something deep inside his chest began to crack, not from shock at Celeste's apparent betrayal, but from a creeping realization that he was witnessing something he had been blind to for far too long. The way Rowan fought against Celeste's restraint, the practiced nature of their struggle, the words that spoke of previous encounters and deeper truths, he turned away. Not out of cowardice, though that was certainly part of it, but from a lifetime of turning away from difficult truths, painful realities, and the needs of a daughter who reminded him too much of the wife he had failed to save. His expensive Italian shoes carried him down the hallway toward his office, each step echoing through the penthouse, like the countdown to an execution he had been postponing for 16 years. Celeste heard the footsteps retreat and felt her heart break for what must have been the 1,000th time since taking this job. She had seen him standing there, had watched him witness what any parent should find unacceptable, and had seen him make the same choice he always made, to walk away, to pretend, to disappear into his work and his grief and his careful construction of a life that required nothing from him except money and absence. "He saw," Rowan whispered, her struggles finally ceasing, as the truth of her father's indifference settled over her like a familiar blanket of despair. "He saw you hurting me, and he just walked away." Her voice carried no surprise, only the hollow confirmation of what she had known in her heart for years. She meant nothing to him. Her pain was invisible, her struggles irrelevant, her very existence an inconvenience he had learned to navigate around. Celeste's grip softened, but did not release, as she looked into the face that was so painfully reminiscent of the woman she had never met, but whose presence still dominated this house. "Ma petite, he doesn't understand. He sees, but he doesn't know what he's seeing. That doesn't make it right, but it doesn't make you worthless either." Her words were a lifeline thrown into dark waters, but Rowan had been drowning for so long that she no longer knew how to reach for salvation. The afternoon stretched on with agonizing normalcy. Thaddeus buried himself in quarterly reports, while the sound of quiet conversation drifted from other parts of the house. Celeste moved through her duties with mechanical precision, but her eyes carried a weight that had not been there that morning. Rowan disappeared into her room, the soft click of her lock echoing through the penthouse, like a door closing on hope itself. The three of them existed in their separate spheres, connected by address and blood and history, but isolated by years of accumulated silence and misunderstanding. As evening approached, Celeste finally did what she had been planning to do for months, but had never found the courage to attempt. She knocked on the office door where Thaddeus had barricaded himself behind mahogany and quarterly projections, waited for his distracted "come in," and stepped into the space where he conducted his real life, the one that mattered to him more than the family crumbling around him. "Mr. Blackwell," she began, her accent more pronounced when she was emotional. "We need to talk." She stood in his doorway like a soldier reporting for a battle she knew she might not survive, but one that had become unavoidable. "About what you saw today. About Rowan. About what's been happening in this house while you've been too busy to notice." He looked up from his computer screens, his face carefully blank in the way he had perfected over 16 years of avoiding difficult conversations. "I'm sure whatever misunderstanding occurred can be resolved without drama, Celeste. Rowan is a teenager. Teenagers are difficult. You handled these situations admirably." His words were a dismissal, a return to the status quo that had kept their household functioning in its broken way for so many years. "She's cutting herself," Celeste said, her words dropping into the silence like stones into still water. "Your daughter has been hurting herself for months, and today I stopped her from carving another line into her arm with a pencil she had sharpened to a point. That's what you saw. That's what you walked away from. That's what you've been walking away from her entire life." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore, impossible to file away with all the other truths he had spent years avoiding. Thaddeus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, like a building settling on a foundation that had never been as solid as he believed. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the whisper of climate-controlled air and the distant hum of a city that continued to function while his world quietly collapsed. "That's impossible," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Even as the words left his mouth, he was remembering things he had chosen not to see. The long sleeves in summer, the way Rowan winced when touched unexpectedly, the careful way she positioned her arms, always crossed, always hidden, the gradual withdrawal that he had attributed to teenage rebellion rather than teenage despair. Celeste moved closer to his desk, her weathered hands gripping the back of a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's cars. "It's not impossible, Mr. Blackwell. It's happening. It's been happening. And if you don't start seeing your daughter, really seeing her, you're going to lose her in a way that no amount of money can fix." Her voice cracked on the last words, carrying pain that went deeper than professional concern. "Why?" The question escaped him before he could stop it, raw and broken in a way that revealed the man behind the successful businessman facade. Why would she do that to herself? She has everything. The best schools, the finest clothes, this house, anything she could want. Even as he spoke, he knew how hollow his words sounded, how completely they missed the point of what a 16-year-old girl actually needed. "Because she thinks she killed her mother," Celeste said quietly. "Because you've spent 16 years looking at her like she's a reminder of your greatest loss instead of your greatest gift." Because she would rather feel physical pain than feel invisible in her own home. Because she's a child who needs her father, and instead she has a stranger who pays for her existence but doesn't participate in her life. The truth hit him like a physical blow, each word finding its mark with devastating accuracy. He thought of Vivian, of the choice she had made to carry their pregnancy to term despite the risks, of the letter she had written him during her final weeks that he had read once and then locked away because the pain was too great to bear. His late wife had chosen their daughter over her own life, had made that decision with full knowledge of the consequences, and he had spent 16 years punishing Rowan for a choice that had never been hers to make. She chose, he whispered, the words torn from some deep place he had kept sealed for over a decade. Vivian chose to have the baby. The doctors told us the risks. They said termination was the safest option, but she refused. She said she would rather die than lose our child. That was her choice, not Rowan's. The admission felt like tearing open an old wound, but for the first time in years, he felt the poison beginning to drain out. Celeste nodded, tears streaming down her face as she watched this powerful man finally begin to confront the grief that had been destroying his family for 16 years. Yes, she chose love. She chose your daughter. She chose to give Rowan life, even knowing it might cost her own. And you've spent every day since then making Rowan pay for that gift. Her words were gentle but uncompromising, the kind of truth that could either destroy or heal, depending on what the listener chose to do with it. I don't know how, Thaddeus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be her father. Every time I look at her, I see Vivian. I see everything I lost, everything I failed to protect. I see the choice that took my wife away from me, even though I know it was the right choice. I know Vivian would be devastated by what I've become, by what I've allowed to happen to our daughter. Then learn, Celeste said simply. Start today. Start now. Go to her room and knock on her door and ask her how she's feeling. Don't leave when she cries. Don't change the subject when it gets uncomfortable. Don't run away to your office or your business trips or your comfortable numbness. Be present. Be her father, before it's too late. The walk to Rowan's bedroom door felt like the longest journey of his life. Each step carried the weight of 16 years of mistakes, of conversations never had, of love never expressed, of a relationship that had been stillborn along with his wife's dreams for their family. He raised his hand to knock, and then hesitated, suddenly aware that he had no idea what to say to this stranger who was his daughter, this young woman who had grown up in his house, but outside his heart. Rowan? His voice was tentative, uncertain, nothing like the commanding tone he used in boardrooms and business negotiations. Can I come in? I think we need to talk. The silence stretched so long that he began to wonder if she had heard him, if perhaps she had fallen asleep, or was simply choosing to ignore him as he had ignored her for so many years. When the lock finally clicked and the door opened, he found himself looking into eyes that were mirrors of his own, filled with a pain so deep and familiar that it took his breath away. Rowan stood in her doorway like a wild animal deciding whether to flee or fight, her arms wrapped protectively around herself in a gesture that suddenly made heartbreaking sense. What do you want? She asked, her voice flat and emotionless in the way of someone who had learned not to hope for things that never came. Did Celeste tell you to check on me? Are you here because she made you feel guilty? Her words were arrows aimed at his heart, each one finding its mark with the precision of someone who had been studying her target for 16 years. I'm here because I saw, he said quietly, stepping into her room for the first time in years. It was like entering a shrine to sadness, filled with dark colors and heavy curtains that blocked out the world beyond her windows. I saw what happened today, and I walked away. I walked away because I've been walking away from you your entire life, and I don't know how to stop." Rowan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitter recognition of a truth finally spoken aloud. "At least you're honest about it. Most parents pretend they care. You've never even bothered to pretend." She moved to her desk, where pencils lay scattered like evidence of interrupted plans, her fingers tracing patterns on the wood surface with nervous energy. "I do care," he said, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in his mouth. "I've always cared. But caring and knowing how to show it are different things, and I've failed at the second part so completely that the first part stopped mattering." He looked around her room, really seeing it for the first time, noting the absence of family photos, the lack of any evidence that she felt connected to the life they shared in this house. "Why?" The question burst out of her with surprising force, months of bottled emotion finally finding release. "Why wasn't I worth learning how to love? Why wasn't I worth staying for? Mom died for me, and you've spent my whole life making sure I know I wasn't worth it. Do you know what that feels like? Do you have any idea what it's like to live every day knowing that your existence cost someone their life, and the only person left who's supposed to love you wishes it had been different?" The anguish in her voice shattered something inside his chest that had been frozen for too long. Without thinking, without analyzing, without retreating into the safe distance he had maintained for years, Thaddeus stepped forward and pulled his daughter into his arms. She fought him at first, her fists beating against his chest as 16 years of abandonment and anger poured out in a flood of tears and accusations. "You were worth it," he whispered into her hair, holding her as she sobbed against his shoulder. "You were always worth it. Your mother knew that. I know that. I've just been too broken by losing her to remember how to show you." His own tears came then, hot and unexpected, washing away years of carefully maintained control as he finally allowed himself to grieve not just for his wife, but for the relationship with his daughter that his grief had destroyed. They stood there in her dim bedroom as the sun set over Boston Harbor, two broken people beginning the long process of learning how to be a family. Celeste watched from the doorway with tears streaming down her face, remembering another daughter she had lost to despair, another family that had been torn apart by grief and misunderstanding. But this time, she had been able to make a difference. This time, love had won. "I don't know how to stop hurting myself," Rowan whispered against her father's chest, her voice muffled but audible. "I don't know how to feel anything else anymore. When I cut, at least I feel something, even if it's pain. The rest of the time I just feel empty." "We'll figure it out together," Thaddeus promised, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll get you help. We'll get us help. We'll learn how to be a family, even if we're starting 16 years too late." He pulled back to look at her face, seeing not just Vivian's features, but Rowan's own unique beauty, her own strength, her own worth, that had nothing to do with her mother's sacrifice and everything to do with who she was as an individual. The healing didn't happen overnight. There were difficult conversations with therapists, family counseling sessions that left them all emotionally drained, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves and send them back to their separate corners of the house. But for the first time in 16 years, they were moving toward each other instead of away, building bridges instead of walls, choosing connection over comfortable isolation. Celeste became not just their housekeeper, but their family guardian, the steady presence who reminded them of their progress when setbacks made the future seem impossible. She shared her own story eventually, telling them about the daughter she had lost to suicide, about the guilt that had driven her to seek out families who needed healing, about the hope that keeping other children alive might somehow honor the memory of the one she couldn't save. Thaddeus learned to leave work at reasonable hours, to ask questions about Rowan's day and wait for real answers, to sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of fleeing to the safety of spreadsheets and quarterly reports. He started therapy himself, finally confronting the grief that had been controlling his life for over a decade, learning to separate his love for Vivian from his responsibility to their daughter. Rowan began the slow process of recovery, working with counselors who specialized in self-harm and depression, learning healthier ways to cope with pain, gradually building a relationship with the father who had been physically present but emotionally absent for most of her life. She started writing, channeling her emotions into poetry and journals instead of carving them into her skin, finding her voice in ways that had nothing to do with her mother's memory. One evening, 6 months after that terrible and wonderful afternoon when everything changed, Thaddeus found himself in his office safe, removing a small velvet box that had remained untouched for 16 years. Inside lay the rose gold bracelet with its tiny swan charm that Vivian had chosen for their unborn daughter, a gift meant to welcome Rowan into the world and remind her always of a mother's love. He found Rowan in the kitchen with Celeste, both of them laughing over some shared joke as they prepared dinner together. The sound of his daughter's genuine laughter was still new enough to make his heart catch, still precious enough to stop him in his tracks with gratitude for second chances and the possibility of redemption. "I have something for you," he said quietly, holding out the box with hands that trembled slightly. "It was your mother's last gift. She picked it out during her final week, wrote a note about when you should receive it. I was supposed to give it to you on your 16th birthday, but I couldn't. I wasn't ready to share her with you. I thought keeping her memory to myself would somehow keep her closer." Rowan opened the box with reverent fingers, gasping softly at the delicate beauty of the bracelet that had been waiting for her all these years. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing the swan charm with one finger. "Will you help me put it on?" The question was simple, but the trust behind it represented months of hard work and healing, the slow rebuilding of a relationship that had never been allowed to properly begin. As he fastened the clasp around her wrist, Thaddeus felt something he hadn't experienced in 16 years. Peace. Not the absence of grief, which would always be part of him, but the presence of hope, the knowledge that love could grow even in soil that had been barren for too long. Vivian's sacrifice had given them life, but it was their choice to finally start living it that would honor her memory. The bracelet caught the light as Rowan moved her hand, the swan seeming to dance with life and possibility. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt beautiful, loved, worthy of the gift that had been given at such great cost. She was no longer just the daughter who had cost a life, but the daughter who had been chosen, treasured, and finally claimed by the father who had taken too long to remember how to love. Celeste watched the small ceremony with tears of joy, knowing that her work in this house was far from over, but believing now that healing was possible, that families could be rebuilt even from the ruins of the deepest grief. She had lost her own daughter, but she had helped save someone else's, and in that salvation found a purpose that made her own pain bearable. The Blackwell family still had work to do, conversations yet to be had, wounds that would take time to fully heal. But they were no longer three isolated people sharing a house. They had become what Vivian had always dreamed they would be when she made her final, loving choice. They had become a family, imperfect and scarred, but finally, truly together. As the Boston skyline glittered beyond their windows and the bracelet caught the lamplight with each movement of Rowan's hand, Thaddeus understood that some gifts are worth any price, that some loves transcend even death, and that it's never too late to choose connection over fear, healing over hiding, family over the comfortable numbness of emotional exile. The swan charm danced on his daughter's wrist like a promise fulfilled, a mother's love finally delivered, and a family's long journey home to each other finally, beautifully complete.